This is the story of my great-grandmother, Yerda Sophia Mathiasson. She was the 8th child of 10 born to her parents. The whole family lived in Uppsala, Sweden, when she was born in December of 1879. Her father, Johan, owned a stone quarry and did contract work repairing streets in Uppsala. Her mother, Christina, managed the home and children. They lived in a large apartment that had its own oven. Every 3 months, Christina would bake knacker bread for the family. This is a cracker-like rye bread baked flat with a hole in the middle. Christina would mix up the dough at 2 a.m. so it would be ready for baking in the morning. After baking, the bread was stored piled onto a wooden pole until it was completely dry. Then it was packaged into paper-lined boxes. Yerda's mother was also known for her skorpers, a dry, biscotti-like baked bread with almonds. In 1870, the whole family joined the Mormon Church. From that point on, they all wanted to emigrate to Utah to live with the majority of other church members. In 1882, Yerda's oldest brother, Oscar, went to America to live with his mother's brother in Chicago. The next year, the next oldest child, Tilly, went all the way to Utah to find work and prepare for the bulk of the family to come. In August 1884, when Yerda was 5, the rest of the family took a steamship to New York. Yerda had lost her 2-year-old sister Wilhelmina to measles in May, and her younger brother Bob had been born in February. Her sister Emma tells of nearly being swept off the deck during rough waves, but being snatched back from the rail by a sailor. At Ellis Island, the family name was shortened from Mathiasson to Matson. They then took a train to Chicago, where the family nearly lost 7-year-old John when the family left him asleep on board the first train when they changed trains to go farther west. Finally, they arrived in Ogden, Utah, where Tilly had rented and furnished a house for all of them. They stayed in Ogden for 3 years while Johan, now known as John, did carpentry work and stonemasonry. In 1887, John and Christina and their younger children moved north to LaBelle, Idaho, where they had their own farmstead. Very shortly afterwards, Tilly and Emma, who had both married, moved up also. Even Oscar moved out to Idaho from Chicago to be with the rest of the family, and he had met his wife in Ogden. The family regularly got together for parties, usually at Oscar's home. They remained close for years in the same area. In 1890, the second oldest daughter, Caroline, died along with her baby and husband from a flu-like sickness. In 1898, Rick, Yerda's older brother, died during one of the family gatherings when he dived into an irrigation ditch and broke his neck. It was through her youngest brother, Bob, and her sister, Emma, that Yerda came to know a friend of Bob's named Fred Mason. Over time, the two became very attached and decided to get married. The original plan was to travel down to Salt Lake City in October of 1904 to be married in the temple there. Unfortunately, Fred came down with typhoid fever in August. He was bedridden all through September and nursed by his sister and Yerda. It wasn't until the last week of September that the fever broke, and there was a possibility Fred would live. By this point, he weighed only 92 pounds, and the doctor had given him orders for him not to try to lift his head for fear that his heart would stop. Despite Fred's health, Yerda wanted to be married so as to take a more active part in his nursing and not to be embarrassed. Fred was reluctant to marry, as there was a real possibility he would still die. But Yerda insisted. They were married by Frank, Fred's brother, in the log cabin where they had lain sick for so long. Fred wrote of the event, "The bride wore a silk dress, the groom wore a white nightgown, and it was with some effort that he drew his arm from the covers to take the hand of the most courageous bride of a generation." Fred eventually regained his strength and worked to support himself and Yerda. In late March in 1906, just a couple of weeks before Yerda gave birth to their first child, Fred was called by the church to serve a mission in Adelaide, Australia. Being both faithful members, neither objected or felt resentful. By borrowing funds from his oldest brother, Fred was able to cover his mission expenses. He left home in December of 1906. Yerda took care of their son, the cow and the hens and the garden. The larger family made sure she was fed and her house kept together. Fred traveled by steamer and spent the next 2 years teaching. In January of 1909, he finally arrived back home. They found it necessary to move into the town of St. Anthony so that Fred could fulfill the church calling he had been given. So in 1910, just before the birth of their first daughter, they found a brick house to live in. Fred had various jobs, many of them elected positions in the county. He was a judge, a coroner, and a town clerk. For Yerda, she had her house and her garden, which provided a good deal of their food, and children coming at regular intervals. After Ruth in 1910, Richard arrived in 1912, Yerda Edith in 1914, Fred Philip in 1918, and Robert in 1920. In May of 1924, Yerda contracted some form of pneumonia and after a 5-day illness passed away. She was only 44.